Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Deepak Reju, and our topic is battling pornography. Deepak, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the time.
Let me tell you about Deepak. He serves as the pastor of biblical counseling and family ministry at Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. Deepak and his wife Sarah have 5 children. He is the author of several books, including Great Kings of the Bible, On Guard, Preventing and Responding to Child Abuse at Church, which I would highly recommend to anyone who is wanting to know more about that issue. The Pastor in Counseling, She's Got the Wrong Guy, and Pornography. He serves on the board of directors of the Biblical Counseling Coalition and also as a trustee for the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation. Our conversation today is about battling pornography. So Deepak, let's jump right in. Before I get exactly to the questions, you said that you spent 9 years in Kentucky in your interaction with Southern. So man, you're almost like a resident of the state, and we'd love to welcome you back anytime that you'd like to come.
Thank you. I love Kentucky, and I'd love to be back at some point.
Tell us how you came to know Jesus and then how you sensed a call into ministry.
Yeah, the short version of it is I grew up in a small Bible-believing church in New Jersey, and a small enough church that there were very few singles in their 20s and 30s. So a young man named Gary, instead of moving on to another church, decided to stay in the church and invest in the teenagers. And I'm the fruit of his faithful ministry. I went to Bible studies every Friday night, and it was a safe environment where Gary would allow us to ask questions. And then my dad and I were not close. We had a fairly distant relationship. So I spent a lot of time with Gary through my high school years. So we went to baseball games and spent a lot of time talking, throwing football and playing basketball. And I just got a lot of life lessons and a lot of wisdom that he invested in me. So I consider him a spiritual father because I came to faith in those Bible studies following Gary's lead, and just went out to college and was blessed by having faithful disciplers over decades. I had a long stream of men who have invested in me and have poured into my life. So I have like 10 different men over several decades who I can point to who are spiritual fathers who in different seasons took the time to invest in my life. That's a short version of it.
Deepak, thank you for sharing that. And man, just pointing us to the Great Commission and the way discipleship works, making disciples who make disciples. Well, let's talk about pornography. So we know it's not only a problem for the world, it's also a problem in the church. Talk to us a little bit about the prevalence of pornography among believers, and then let's talk about why church leaders should develop a plan to address it. So let's just start with the prevalence of pornography.
Yeah, it's very prevalent. It's hard not to run into someone who struggled with it in the past.
Yeah.
And that's pretty common. If you're a pastor, you've done any premarital counseling and you've had to ask hard questions about their background and you've gotten to know them and then they shared their struggles, then you'll have heard about the incidents. Now, I have young men in their 20s and 30s and guys in their 40s and sometimes 50s who show up. And, you know, the guys in their 20s are coming in having struggled with it typically a decade or more. They've run into it as a teenager. Guys in their 30s have had a longer battle with it, 2 decades plus. That's a long time to be fighting. And the new wave, so for years as a pastor, I've done premarital counseling, officiated weddings, discipled young men, and the conversation has been about men. Now, I'm getting my first wave of young women who are coming forward and confessing.
Wow. So
premarital counseling is not just about men confessing to their girlfriend. It's about the boyfriend and the girlfriend now engaged, both having struggled.
So
it's growing, and it's going to be even more common.
So you're in lots of conversations with lots of people in your church context and probably far beyond that, given that you've written about this subject. What are some of the challenges what are some ways that pornography just really ruins relationships, hurts marriages, devastates the believer who's battling with it? What do you notice on how this particular stronghold defeats men and women?
Yeah, well, let's first think about the believer. What does the evil one love to do? He loves to stack evidence against our assurance.
Yeah.
And if someone not just struggles with it a few times, but most of these addicts, like I described, are struggling with it for years on end, you get to this place where you begin to doubt how you could conceivably be a child of God.
Right.
if you keep doing the sin again and again and again. So assurance is a major way that the evil one undermines any kind of believer who's fighting this battle. So that's typical for a Christian. It is hard to believe sometimes how pervasive it is. Mm-hmm. So I think the church often underestimates like how much this is going on. But if you get into the trenches of discipling people and they're being honest about sharing things in their lives, you begin to run into it pretty often and see how common it is amongst the people who are sitting in the pews today. So, you have on a church-wide, you need to not underestimate the problem. And personally with believers who struggle with it, they need to not give in to the lies that the evil one preaches at them, that, the evil one whispers in their ear. There's no way you could be a believer if you've been struggling with it this many years.
So Deepak, we're talking to pastors and church leaders, ministry leaders. Can you offer for us some reasons? I've asked you to come up with 5 reasons why church leaders should develop a plan to address pornography in their own ministry context. What's first on your list of the why?
Yeah, so pornography has not been a problem just in the internet. Like the 50s and 60-year-old men will remember having to go to a store, a newspaper stand, and get either dare I say it, Blockbuster. Younger generations won't remember that, right. But the adult section video to get that and bring that home, or to get a Penthouse magazine, stick it in a bag, and walk away with it. And that's what it was in older generations. Now you have it available. You have a time bomb available on every phone.
Yeah, that's right.
You have access to it wherever you go, which has ruined now generations of men's view on sex. It has objectified women in a way that God had never intended. Yeah. And so therefore, all kinds of men are walking around with a really corrupt view of what sexuality is. That's my first reason why pastors need to care.
Okay, what's second?
Second, too many men will not be able to serve in leadership because they're disqualified because of this struggle. We've run into so many men who have either had a history and have not defeated it, or are still addicted to it, who are coming to church, they're faithfully serving, they're engaged in the word, they're a part of our church's life, and yet they'll never be able to be a deacon or a pastor because this sin continues to hamper them. So we've lost more deacon candidates potentially to serving because a lack of self-control is a disqualification.
So Deepak, on that subject alone, how do you is there a survey that you guys are giving for potential deacon candidates, or is there an interview where this comes out?
There's an interview. Yeah. There's an interview. So we'll approach a potential candidate, ask if that person is interested, get them to read the biblical requirements, get them to talk to their closer friends about whether this is a good thing for them to do, and if that seems all fitting, then we will sit down with them and give them a more in-depth interview, including asking about habitual sins.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many men were knocked out because of that question, which is just a sad reality of how pervasive this problem is. Yes. So you want to get out ahead of this because you want qualified, godly men serving in your church in leadership.
So how's that question come up? Are you asking, like, here are some examples of habitual sins? If any of these are a problem for you, this would be a time to tell us, or are you asking directly about pornography?
Well, no, I'm asking them, are there any habitual sins? Because I recognize pornography is pervasive, but if a man has a chronic anger issue and is ruining his home, he's also disqualified. So I'm looking for any chronic issues. Like, we all struggle with pride, but that's not the issue we're talking about here.
Right. All right, so what's third on your list?
It's not just a man's problem anymore.
Okay.
There is a rising tide of young women who are hooked on porn, and so both men and women are affected. And so now we have to expand our view, because for so long we bought into a lie that this is only a man's problem.
Yeah.
But it's not, and pornography use has become fairly normalized amongst teenagers. And you can just tell by like the kind of programs they're watching. You go on to any popular teen show on Netflix, and the way they portray high schoolers and junior high kids as if porn is just the perfectly acceptable thing for them to do with one another. So we need to be ready for this rising tide of young women who are actually showing up in our churches.
So the prevalence then is makes it rise to the occasion that it should be addressed. What's your fourth reason that a church should figure out a way to address this issue?
Well, as Christians, we want to look different than the culture.
Yeah.
We want to be countercultural, and killing porn habits is a way to say the gospel is real, God wins, and God's got a better plan than what the evil one intends. Ignoring the problem and not addressing it gives Satan a foothold in our churches. And we just don't want to do that.
Yeah, that's a great list. And so what's number 5 on your list?
Well, as pastors, maturity is the goal.
Yeah.
So Colossians 1:28 and 29, Paul says, "For this I toil." What is he toiling for? To see everyone mature in Christ. And this is a major stumbling block to our members maturing in their faith.
Deepak, those are great reasons. So let's think about the practical side of addressing pornography in the church. Preaching is one of the primary ways, or the primary way, that pastors address sins of all sorts in the congregation, including pornography. Many pastors in Kentucky preach through books of the Bible, verse by verse, and pornography would come up when it comes up. It's also a mixed crowd that you're speaking to on Sunday mornings, all ages, from very young to older. So talk about some practical ways that pastors and church leaders could address pornography in the church.
Yeah, first things first, preaching expositionally means you're teaching books of the Bible. And of course, there are so many verses preaching against sexual immorality. Mm-hmm. And so you should preach those verses. But what you don't want is your congregation just hears the no about sexual immorality. Because God's got a beautiful plan for sexual intimacy in marriage. And so you want to preach a high view of that beautiful plan to your congregation, which is the point of having books like Song of Solomon in the Bible. Mm-hmm. It's to teach the beauty of intimacy within a permanent covenant relationship. And so you don't want to back away from books like Song of Solomon. You want to preach the full robustness of that book. You want to preach all of the books of the Bible because they're all inspired. So the way to get out ahead of this is to actually lay out God's plan and not just preach against the wrongness of sexual immorality. Mm-hmm. You want both. You really want both. But I see far too many pastors preach about immorality but never talk about the beauty of what God intends. And how are the kids, the teenagers, the young adults who are going to get married, right, how are they ever going to get a view of what God wants for them when it comes to sexual intimacy if they ever get married? How are the husbands hooked on pornography ever going to get their view of God's plan for sexuality corrected and changed by God's power? How are the women who are arriving in our pews ashamed and not sure how they could be hooked on this too? How are they ever going to get it corrected? Mm-hmm. So I want to preach a high view of that. But the other problem I want to make sure, as we said, it's often been billed as a man's problem. I want to make sure when you preach, you don't just lay it out as a man's problem, but you say, women, if you're struggling, recognize that God has a plan for you too. As there are women here who likely do struggle with pornography and sexual immorality. And so therefore, help them to understand what God intends, but also set up the boundaries for them. So preach to men and women. And in the end, how do you change the culture in your church? It's by your teaching and preaching. Mm-hmm. That's how you transform a church culture. By what you say in the pulpit, it transforms the values. So the pastor is the primary culture shaper in their church. What they teach and what they preach and then how they live shapes the values in that church. Well, do you want people to have a high view of God's intentions and plans for the beauty of sexual intimacy? Well, then preach it. Preach it in all the robustness that Scripture offers us. That's the pulpit.
Yep. Okay. What's next?
The pew.
Okay.
So you want to raise a culture of disciplers in your church because the problem is too big of a problem for pastors to handle on their own.
Right.
If the stats are true, then the pastoral staff can't handle this by themselves, nor should they. That's just not healthy for any pastor to be taking on those kinds of burdens. So raising up a culture of disciplers within a church where every member cares about investing in other members is going to allow other members, not just pastors, not just deacons, but everyday members who are mature and trusting the word and loving Jesus, coming alongside other members and helping them through their problems. So that's what changes the calculus. So pastors can be involved, but we want the members to be involved too in caring for these strugglers. And then the last one is one-on-one.
Okay.
Pastors have got to get in the trenches. If they stay in an ivory tower of theology, then they're not going to know their people, and they need to come alongside their people and get in the trench. So disciple a few people who are struggling with this, and it'll help you get a clear sense of what addiction really is. It'll change the nature of your application you're preaching. Like, if you know your people, it'll show in your preaching, because it'll show in the application when you're explaining the text.
Yeah, no question about it. As you're interacting with people and you're dealing with the issues that they're dealing with, it's going to come across. So, Deepak, you already mentioned that a couple of generations ago, had a different approach to access pornography. Any generation today has a smartphone or access to a smartphone, so they have an adult bookstore in their hand at all times, 24/7. How can believers fight against pornography in a world that is just so saturated with inappropriate images, visuals and content?
Yeah, so here's a short term, more immediate, and then I'll give you a little bit of long term.
Okay.
So the short term, if someone's struggling with pornography, the first thing you do is find the most godly person in your church who you will willing to spend time with, who's of the same gender, and beg them for their help.
Yeah.
Just find the most mature person around you and start there. And then the second step is both of you aggressively look at how to cut off all the access points to pornography. And most people learn to begin to cut off access points, but as I sit down and talk to people, what you find is they cut off 50 or 60 or 70 or 80%, but they leave open access points, which when you're in a weak moment, what are you going to do? You're going to reach through those access points and get illicit material. And we understand from Matthew 5, Jesus is not light on sin.
Right.
He uses hyperbole to say, gouge out your eye and cut off your arm, which means take seriously the sin problem that you have and take radical steps to deal with it. So be brutal about cutting off access points. It does not solve the problem, but it's an important first step in dealing with it. So that's the two short term.
Okay.
Find a godly person and cut off the access points. Long term, real briefly, here's a couple of things. Accountability, you need to find decent accountability that does a good job at working. Because for most people, accountability is fairly bad. Yeah. They don't have godly people who are consistent with them, that are teachable, that are kind and loving and gracious. Right. They have people who are inconsistent, that are more militant and condemning. Yeah. And so it's no surprising that accountability is hard. Good accountability is hard to find.
Yeah.
Second, heart desires. Fundamentally, if you get behind addiction, what's behind it? It's an appetite. It's an appetite for the wrong things. It's that fundamental desire. I want something that's destructive for me. And so you got to get after the deeper motivations in a person's heart. And then gospel community, you cannot do this on your own. Yeah. So a lot of the stuff from pornography reduces it to like one-on-one accountability or one-on mini group accountability, but you need a body of believers. If that's what God's plan is, you need a solid gospel community to be embedded in, or else you're just not going to make it.
So Deepak, years ago there was a book by Steve Atterburn called Every Man's Battle, and then of course you have your book out now. Along with your book, are there other resources you'd recommend to pastors who just want to learn more about this issue and how to interact with their church members?
Yeah, there's actually a number of good resources on the market right now. So I did a 31-day devotional on pornography, which is meant to be a short devotional. It's like like a blog post worth of material every day, right, meditating on a scripture text. Then for the pastor, I did 2 books called Rescue Plan and Rescue Skills. That's not for the struggler. It's actually meant to equip a deacon, a small group leader, a pastor, a parent of a teenager who's struggling. And we lay out a theology of addictions. We talk about masturbation as a problem that goes with it. We talk about single and married, but we also talk about dating. What does the girlfriend do when her boyfriend confesses? Yeah. And then we talk about teenagers. How does the parent deal with it? And then we give skills that a discipler needs and skills that a discipler needs to instill in the young man or woman who's struggling. Then Garrett Kell's book, Pure at Heart, is another excellent resource. It's solid on the gospel and theology, but good on things like community and how to fight this battle. Would be really a wonderful recommendation to commend to others. That's actually the first book I give to strugglers,
okay.
Garrett's book, and then I get them to read my devotional.
Those are great resources. So you mentioned it already in our conversation here that there's a fruit issue and a root issue, a manifestation of sin through pornography, but also the heart issue behind it. Can you talk a little bit more about what is the heart root struggle underneath the pornography addiction or stronghold?
Yeah, so let's think of 4 A's. Anonymity, access, appetite, and atheism. That's a shorthand to kind of capture the whole conversation. So access we already talked about. Are there open access points in which you can get illicit material? Cut them off and be brutal about it. Anonymity, you don't do this in a public space when everybody else is walking around looking at your screen. You have to be alone to get this done. Yep. And so you want to ruin your ability to be in a place isolated by yourself to do it. But then appetite is what I was mentioning earlier. Fundamental behind an addiction is the desires, the carnal desires that rule our heart. So I call them ruling desires that sit on our throne. They're the ones that we orient our whole life around. And if we have desires that get out of control, they really dictate the pace for our whole life. But most of the time, addictions stop at that conversation. But if we understand faith, we understand that doubt of God's character is fundamental to this battle. That's where atheism comes in. Look at any motivation that an addict has. You double click on it, you see doubt of God's character, whether it's his goodness or his sovereignty or his love. So, take an example. I got a guy who's struggling with stress at work, so he uses pornography to escape the stress. He shuts the door and he plunges into porn to just relieve the stressed out emotions that he has. Mm-hmm. So he'll say to me, I can't handle the stress. That's why I use porn. Well, that's escapism. That's fundamental. But what I'd say to him, if you double click on that, what you see is like he doesn't trust God to help him handle the stress. Mm-hmm. It's not just about not how he handles the stress, but who's handling the stress. Is he turning to the Lord and getting the Lord to give him strength to deal with it? Or is he giving up on the Lord and finding a way to satisfy it for himself?
So Deepak, you're hitting a trigger there is his stress that you're describing, but the response could be all kinds of sin issues, pornography just being one of them. It could be overeating or lashing out or long naps or whatever. So what are other triggers or background issues that you've seen that men are using pornography or women are using pornography as the escape or the medicine for?
Yeah, let's just talk about a wide range of things. Like a teenager having sex with a young girl with her boyfriend. It's actually not about the porn. Yeah. Because the last teenager I dealt with, she was not just having sex, he was getting her to watch porn with her. Wow. And she ended up getting addicted to it, and then shows up in my office. But why was she having sex or watching porn? Because she wanted some sense of affirmation. Right. Yeah. It wasn't about the sex. She wanted to feel loved by someone. Yeah. Or what else do you have in terms of desires? There are college students that I have who are bored to death with their life. Mm-hmm. Saturday afternoon, they don't want to study anymore. They're trapped in their dorm room. It's bad weather outside. What are they going to do? They're going to open up their computer, wander around, eventually find themselves in pornography. So boredom, a lack of sense of adventure, is actually going to be a problem. Mm-hmm. And I just mentioned escapism. Yeah. Escapism in all kinds of forms is a form of motivation. You just start going on and on down the list. People reduce it to lust. Yeah. But there's more to it than just lust.
So Deepak, you discover a man that the stress is his issue. He's thought about this long enough to realize that I do this when I'm under stress. The stress at work is so much, and I turn to pornography. So how do you help him get God involved in his stress? Like, how do you help him get off that path and get on a different path?
Yeah, first things first, we start with first conversation I ever have, I talk to guys about Matthew 5 and cutting off and taking access points seriously. And so putting things like covenant eyes, I'll get guys to bring their phone or their laptop, and I will sit down with them and actually get into the software with them and help them set up restrictions. Like I don't trust that every guy is competent with technology and understands how to handle this. And so I want to get down into nitty gritty and get alongside of them and help them learn how to handle their phone or computer. So not only I'm talking about the theology of cutting it off, I'm trying to take practical steps. So I've had to learn to be virtually an expert on the iPhone, and learning how to completely shut it down.
And that's just discipleship. I mean, you are doing basic discipleship.
Yeah, like I'm not just going to preach at you the problem and tell you need to fix it. Let's just go ahead and do it together.
Yeah, and that's not going to happen in a classroom. That is a one-to-one relationship. That's a close, intimate relationship with a brother that you're trying to help grow in the Lord.
So now once they usually put covenant eyes, they put restrictions on their phone, what you usually see is a slowing down of the consumption of porn. That's typical. Like covenant eyes is a shame-based tool. How does it work? It shows what you've been doing online to other people. It motivates you out of a sense of shame to stop looking at things. Is it foolproof? No. And that's what I said earlier. Like what you find is then there are a few lingering access points. And I find what those lingering access points are over the weeks that come, because it goes from looking at it a couple of times a week to maybe a couple of times a year, or maybe 1 or 2 times in a month. And those 1 or 2 times a month, I dive into that incident and say, okay, what's the access point? Let's brutally cut that off. The classic mistake is to leave open a few access points. And what do people do? In a weak moment, they plunge right through that access point and get illicit material. Now, the process then, if fundamentally behind an addiction is the desire, what are we trying to do? We're trying to starve the desire over the course of time. Like you feed a dragon meat, it just grows. You want to kill the dragon, well, lock it down, put it under chains, put a boulder in front of the cave, and then leave it alone for a couple of years. It'll starve to death. But that takes time. Takes love and patience and time to help. And especially with addicts who show up and they've been addicted for 10 years. I do not have a Burger King quick fix answer to get you out of an issue if you've been in this thing for 10 years. So I've been in the trenches with guys sometimes for years before we saw it completely gone. But if a guy shows up and he says, I need help, I'm like, all right, well, I'll be in it with you until you tell me you don't want me anymore. Like we'll go to the distance if we need to. And the grace of God is wonderful that we have pastors in our church now who 2 or 3 decades ago, we were all in our 20s in this church, struggling with porn. And now many of these men are years removed from the problem. So nobody can tell me that it's not possible for a guy to fully get over this. I've seen a front row seeing men defeat this. So you need to be patient over time. But I really do believe the power of an expulsive affection. You can't just starve the bad desires. You've got to actually put them in the gospel regularly so that gospel affections take over and actually fill up their soul and give them what they need in order to fight that daily battle. That means they need to be in the Word themselves, be in church regularly, have the Word regularly fed to them, a regular daily diet. And I really believe that like just simply one-on-one is not going to do it. Like if you put them in a gospel community where they're saturated with the Word, that is going to actually begin to rebuild their operating system from inside out over the course of time. So coming to church, being in the Word, having friends that regularly give you not just the Word, but encouragement. So I need a brother that not only is going to tell me the Word, but he's going to hug me when I'm down. Or I need a brother when I'm having a really bad weekend who's going to say, like, come on over, have dinner with me, and let's pray together. I mean, I just need those kinds of people in my life in order to do it. And what you see over time is like that combination of the strategy plus gospel community over the long haul helps us with tons of these men and women who are struggling.
So Deepak, you have 5 children of your own. You're in a church full of children. At what age do you start talking to children about this issue? Well,
okay, so let me put it in 2 ways. One, what I want is just like I said, pastors need to preach from the pulpit, a high view of God's intention for sexuality. Well, parents need to make clear God's plans in an age-appropriate way from, I think, a very young age, because, the stats show, like I pulled one stat this morning and said, a recent media survey found an average of most kids were exposed to porn by 12 years of age.
Wow. Yeah.
15% first saw porn when they were 10 years old or younger.
Yeah.
Which means porn is going to catch up to your kids.
Right.
So the question is, are you going to get out ahead of it? Which reduces this to the discipleship of parents to their kids. Mm-hmm. If you're invested in your kids' lives, part of your discipleship is teaching them God's plan for sexuality, so they have a view of the beautiful plan that God intends before they get exposed to pornography. Because then you can put porn in its proper context. Rather than what I find is parents not teaching their kids anything about this, waiting till their teenage years to have the talk. Mm-hmm. And what's the talk? Get in one time, have a conversation that's awkward, and then get back out.
Right.
That's what parents' goal is. Well, you're gonna miss the boat if you wait till that late right now. So you got to get out ahead of it. So address this biblically with your kids from an early age. There are actually a couple of really good book series that are available right now. Stanton Jones was the former provost of Wheaton College. Mm-hmm. Wrote an entire series with his wife that you can find on Amazon if you put Stanton Jones in there, and it's a series that begins at a young age, and it just portrays a beautiful view of what God intends. And then as it gets older, it starts introducing the problem in the context of God's bigger plan. And that's a just much better way to teach your kids about how to deal with it.
So Deepak's fascinating conversation. We could talk a long time, but you've offered just incredible help, I think, for folks who will listen to this later. So this podcast is called Leadership Lessons. Let me ask you a leadership question. Can you tell us an experience in your life or ministry that has shaped your approach to or understanding of leadership?
Yeah, I've worked for Mark Dever, who is my direct boss, for now 16 years, but I've known him for 28 years, ever since he landed at our church. And I would say, in a culture where there are a lot of pastors who have strong personalities and strong backbone and strong convictions, sadly, a lot of times what you don't see paired with that is humility. And what I've really appreciated being alongside of him is, say, in our meetings as an elder board, he loses votes all the time.
Yeah.
And, one time, associate pastor and I, because we're up close to his life, we realized we had to confront him on something in terms of his own sin. The other associate pastor said, as we're walking in to talk to him, said, some associate pastors get fired for this kind of conversation. Yeah. Like, you should have said that after we had the conversation, right. Not before.
Yeah, that's right.
But what I really appreciate is he humbly received our exhortation. Yeah. And then every week as a staff, we review the Sunday service, and even the interns give him feedback on his sermon. Yeah. And so one time a visiting pastor said, why do you let the interns give you feedback? These guys, many of these haven't even been in ministry yet. And he said to them, some of their comments are actually fairly useless, but if I can't model receiving feedback from everyone in the room,
that's good.
How on earth are they ever going to learn it?
Yeah, it's really good.
So, it stuck with me. It's like, I want to lead. I want to have clear convictions. I want to be a dynamic and courageous leader, but I don't want to miss the boat when it comes to, say, like Mark 10. I want to be a servant, humble leader. Yeah. I want to be a Philippians 2, humble, servant-hearted leader. So that would be my main lesson.
That's excellent. Yeah, great story. Appreciate you bringing up Mark Dever. He is a Kentucky boy, so he has that going for him as well.
That's true. Very true.
Deepak, if our listeners want to know more about you or your ministry, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, Capitol Hill Baptist, www.capitolbaptist.org. Okay. They can reach out to the church, and I get calls, I get emails from pastors across the country all the time, trying to help them with everything from child abuse to pornography issues to, after this call, I'll counsel one of our members and jump on a call with two pastors, another part of the country, helping them sort through an issue that they're trying to work through with one of their members. So I love hearing from pastors, and I love helping pastors. So I'm very glad to hear from them.
Thank you for making yourself available. I would add one more plug to this book. If a church is trying to work through their policy, your policy at Capitol Hill is very robust. The average church wouldn't do as much as you're doing, but this is a great resource on protecting children from sexual predators. Deepak, thank you for your ministry at Capitol Hill through counseling and writing, and thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Glad to do it. Thanks for the time.